Australia, the sixth largest country on Earth. An ancient, rugged, and unforgiving land with abundant animal life, both beautiful and deadly. Found within its awe-inspiring landscapes and natural beauty exists a deep history of unexplained mysteries for anyone with the courage to investigate them. Tonight, we join Ben on a journey across this vast island continent in search of answers to events that have reshaped the lives of so many that have been exposed to Unexplained Phenomena Australia, with your host, Ben Hurl.
G'day everyone, and welcome to another episode of Unexplained Phenomena Australia. If you were with me last week, you'll remember that we were looking at the Kempsey Mystery, which occurred in 1971 and 1972 in North Coast, New South Wales. Now, if you enjoyed it last week, there was so many encounters that actually occurred during that period of time, and we really only got about halfway through it in last week's episode. So I thought we'd continue with that. There's no way known you can talk about the Kempsey UFO flap in an hour. It's just not possible. And I'm hoping that I can achieve it in a two-part episode today. There was just what I really like about it is that there's so much variety of events that occur during this flap. And the biggest one was the gentleman who was sucked out the window, which we spoke about in the first episode last week. And I've just got a new picture of that to show you. And this one is courtesy of Bill Chalker, an Australian researcher based in Sydney, New South Wales. And this is what really got my attention with the Kempsey case. A Aboriginal man went out to his kitchen sink and he was going to get a drink of water. And he saw a strange face in the window. And then the next minute, he was sucked out through that window and fell down 7 feet. And he only had a small cut on his hand and no other physical injuries. So that was but he was absolutely terrified, as you would be. And I thought, wow, that's a pretty incredible thing to happen. And then we also saw that there was close encounters with craft coming out of the sky, young boys who had seen a classic flying saucer come down, drop its landing legs, and land some way off, and a whole host of other sightings in the sky. So it was a really rich time of UFO activity in the Kempsey area in New South Wales. But that also fits within a greater UFO flap around Australia. And on many other episodes, I've already discussed a lot of UFO cases that actually did occur in 1971, 1972, 1973. So for some reason, that was a very busy period of time. And then when Close Encounters of the Third Kind came out, after that, there was a lot more people looking at the sky as well in the latter part of the 70s, and Star Wars too. So it's good to see how Hollywood can influence people's interests, pique people's interest in this phenomenon. But people who have these sightings, they basically never do forget them. And I thought these Kempsey experiences were just absolute gold, because it's a complete and utter cluster of high strangeness events occurring in and around the one location. Now, just recap where that was for those who perhaps didn't see last week's episode. So Kempsey is in New South Wales on the east coast of Australia, and it is basically on the north coast. So where that red dropper is the area. So Sydney's to the south, Canberra to the south, and then you've got the Gold Coast and Brisbane above that area. So that's the That's the region of Australia that we are discussing. So we will continue the journey, if you like. And this week, I thought I had a fair bit of information on it, but I'd been talking to Bill Chalker during the week, and he was kind enough to enlighten me on some additional cases that occurred in the Kempsey area after 1972. So there was cases through 1973, 75, 76. So it was just the intensity of the flap that had reduced. So I thank Bill very much for bringing that out to me, so I could have that information, and also some of the pictures that I'm going to share today too are also courtesy of Bill. So that was really, really good. So we will pick up from where we left off. And so what we'd been doing on the previous show was I decided that it was really the local paper in that area, the Macleay Argus, that had captured all this UFO history. And that's where a lot of the history has been caught throughout the world, is in the newspapers. And it's a hell of a job trying to track down newspaper articles, particularly old ones like this, because they're long shelved. They've been put away a long time ago. These are old events. So it does make it hard to track down information. But when you do, it's gold. And it also often comes through the newspapers. And this is what I did last week. So we explored the history that the Macleay Argus had recorded at that time. So I'll just recap on the last one that I spoke about last week, and then we'll continue on, and you'll see how many of these sightings there actually were. And some of them are of higher grade than others, but they are all interesting. So Thursday, April 29th, 1971, the Argus had yet another article on UFOs. And this one was called More Lights on the Same Subject. And the mystery of strange lights in the Macleay skies, because the Macleay River runs sort of through Kempsey, so that's why it's called Macleay. The mystery of the strange lights in Macleay continue to grow with each new sighting. 5 more reports have been received, 2 confirming the sightings of a silvery grey object in the sky at 8:30 on Friday, and 3 reported fresh sightings. 4 teenagers said this week that they had seen a large red glowing light near the Warwick Park racecourse on April 20. The light had appeared to be about tree level and was moving very fast in a northerly direction towards Columbatti, Frederickson. These are just little areas that are outside and around Kempsey, all in the local area. And the teenagers declined to be named. They said that the light appeared to be about a foot in diameter, and they followed it by car along North Street and down Second Street to the Pacific Highway, which is the big highway that runs in that area. And one of the teenagers said the light was all this time traveling in a direct line towards Columbatti, which, if you watched last week, you saw there's nothing there. It's just a really little area with a railway line running through it. When it was directly over Columbatti, it was joined by 3 smaller lights, which came from nowhere. The smaller lights then started traveling north at the same speed as the larger light. And the teenagers said they watched it for about 5 or 10 minutes before the lights disappeared. All of them thought at first the lights might have been warning lights on the Smithtown radio tower, which is to the right of Kempsey. However, the light was also on their right. As they chased it at all times, it was low in the sky. And a Mr. Clary Briggs of Smithtown said that he had seen a pulsating light in the eastern sky at about 7:15 p.m. on Saturday night. The light tended to glow and change colours constantly. And he said, I watched it with my family for about 20 minutes. And then it began to move up and down and occasionally sideways. It began to fade and it disappeared. Eventually, this light reappeared, and every 15 seconds, it was changing colour from red to green, blue, and so on. And on Sunday night, Mr. Briggs said he had seen a similar light about the same time over the Columbatti-Fredericton area, moving up and down and sideways. It was not a star. A young woman said that she and 3 others watched from West Street and had seen a light north of Kempsey on Tuesday night, which was a reddish colour and appeared surrounded by smoke. The light had moved sideways and up and down and had then moved in a southwest direction. They had been so scared that they had gone home. Mr. Max Marvin of South Kempsey and Miss Jean Piggott of West Kempsey both have confirmed a sighting of a silvery grey object trailing fire or a bright light reported over the Macleay area at 8:30 last Friday. Mr. Marvin said that he had seen the object flash across the sky from east to the southwest, and he described the light as brilliant, like an oxy torch was his description, and the head appeared to be red hot. And Miss Piggott said that she had been travelling to work at Nestle's in Smithtown, and had seen a brilliant white and pink light cross the sky while driving down the Smithtown Road. So as you can see, it really is just, these events were just occurring. So on that one article, they've got multiple sightings that have been reported, and that had happened constantly throughout the Kempsey flap. So just a couple of photos just to give you a bit of an idea of where it is. So this is that Smithtown location, and this shows a few things here. So down to the west at the bottom left of that picture is Kempsey, which nestles in on that bend of the river at the bottom of the screen. And then you've got Fredericton, which is halfway up if you follow that yellow road. And then when you go to the top and follow around to that red outline area, that's where Smithtown is. So this is that location around the river in that area. And Columbatti is off to the top left-hand corner of that picture. There's only so much I can show on these on these Google Maps. So that's so in that entire area, that's where all those incidences were occurring at that time. Now we're going to move on to another area. Now this is we have very interesting names in Australia, and this little locality is called Willy Willy, which is Willi, Willy Willy. And on Thursday, May 13, 1971, there was an article in the Argus that said, the headline was, "A sighting at Willy Willy of a UFO." So I'll just show you where Willy Willy is. So here we go. So if you look, this is the similar to that other picture, but it's showing you more to the west. So we've got Kempsey at the bottom of the screen where the river makes that U-bend down there. And we've got Columbatti is just to the north of that, following the yellow line. And then if you go right across to the left of the image, you'll see Willy Willy, which is outlined in that red area. And as you can see, there really is nothing there. Now, if you also notice a couple of other towns that pop up in this episode as well, there's Taruka, which is just to the northeast of Willy Willy, and then down to Willawarren. It is just down to the south of Taruka. So between those 3 little towns, well, they're not towns, they're just basically farming areas, in that triangle there, in that triangular area, that's where a lot of these encounters were occurring. And then across to Columbatti, back across to the right-hand side of the picture. And then, of course, you've got Kempsey down there. So as you can see, this whole region at that time was really, really active. And so with this encounter, a sighting at Willy Willy of UFOs, a schoolgirl and two of her relatives reported sighting a UFO near Willy Willy late on Monday. And the object was first sighted by Sue Johnson, and she was 15 years old. And she was from Cronulla, and Cronulla is a suburb in Sydney. And I think their football team is the Cronulla Sharks. And she was holidaying at Willy Willy. which is 40 miles west of Kempsey, as we've seen in the photo. And she was holidaying with her grandparents, Mr. and Mrs. John Fisher. Mr. Fisher and his daughter, Helen Ross, her mother, also sighted the object, which appeared to be travelling north. This is out at Willy Willy. Sue made the first sighting at about 5:15 p.m, and she said that she had been in a paddock feeding carrots to a horse. And we do that here. A very common country activity. And noticed suddenly the early evening sky was turning from grey to pink and the clouds to a flaming red. And she said that I saw this red streak above my head. It was quite long and came fast across the sky. Then she saw this metallic thing, and it seemed to slow down and hovered over her head as if looking for something. And this is when Sue started yelling, as you probably would. It seemed to be right over my head, she said, and not at great altitude. It gave me such a fright. The thing was flying at such an odd angle to the sun that I couldn't see the whole shape. It appeared to be banking towards the hills to the north and seemed to have a belly the shape of a football. The top was peaked and the sides sloped in to join the belly. It was close enough for me to see very strange marks at each end, and they were oddly angled. And at the front end was over what appeared to be a door of some sort. The tail and the exhaust was astonishingly red, so a very vivid red, and a very long tail. And she said what was most extraordinary about this was the fact that there was no noise whatsoever. No noise out of this object. The thing seemed to be so close to me that if it had been an aircraft, I would have been deafened by the noise. This is Willy Willy, 1971. There was another strange thing. As the object went into the hills, the skies turned back to a grey colour and the clouds went to pink. This all happened in a matter of 2 minutes. Now, her mother, Mrs. Lee, said that she had been attracted to the calls. Mrs. Lee is her auntie, to the calls made by her niece, and had gone outside to see what the matter was. And she said, we had been looking at the sky and noticed how the clouds, which were very grey and scattered across the sky, started to glow and become pink. The sun had already set, and then suddenly I saw the light in the sky in a lovely shade of pink. I heard Sue yelling and saw her tearing across the paddock, pointing to the sky. And then I saw this fiery red tail move across the sky, and soon I picked up a little cigar-shaped grey object, and it disappeared towards the MacGyver's property, which obviously was the neighbours. And Mr. Fisher, the grandfather, a grazier and a former engineer, described the object as silver grey in colour and said he saw it some little time after his granddaughter. And he described it as the exhaust was red and as fine as a taper, so a long sort of a taper in a brilliant red colour. The object had no appearance of an aircraft. It was dome-shaped and travelled across the valley from about due south to north. You could not credit the speed of it. It took about 90 seconds to cross the sky, and he supposed he had it in view for about 35 to 40 seconds. I would say it was at least 6 to 10 miles in the sky and a pretty big object for us to see as well. The exhaust itself must have been huge to have been so clearly seen for such a distance. The number of sightings of objects and lights in the Macleay Valley since the beginning of April has gone into the double figures. So that's a fairly intense encounter out at Willy Willy, and it's not the only encounter out there. And so what we'll have a look at now, we've seen that is the location. So there's Willy Willy, again, out there to the left of screen. And this is directly over that location. So as you can see, it's very hilly and mountainous terrain, and the river runs in very tight formation through that area. So it's quite quite a remote little part of the world. And where it says Willy Willy there, there's a little gathering of houses right at that junction there. So it's not a big place, very, very small. And this other picture gives you another idea. So this is what we're talking about. There's no shops, there's nothing there other than farmhouses. So that's the Willy Willy area. And then on Tuesday, June 1st, 1971, the Argus had yet another UFO article. The people must have felt like they were being invaded at that time. And this article was called Lights Over Willy Willy. Haulage contractors or truck drivers have sighted another UFO. An unidentified white light in the centre of a much larger light was spotted on the weekend in Willy Willy, west of Kempsey. Two contract haulage operators, Mr. John Clark and Mr. John Arnold, saw the strange light at 5:15 a.m. on Sunday as they were driving to work on the Karai Plateau. They described the object as a small white light, similar to a car headlight, with a great red flash behind it. The lights were low in the sky, but not low enough to be anything on the ground. It was dark at the time. Mr. Clark said the light seemed to be moving in a jerking manner. And you do hear that in UFO reports that they do travel in a jerking style. But there was no noise. The middle light did not move from the centre of the larger light, he said. We had stopped on the road and I had turned the engine of the truck off. And then this light caught my eye from where we stood. It looked about 6 inches wide, but it was some way off. It was just like a car headlight with a great red flash behind it. The strange thing about it was the colour and the way it seemed to be jerking across the sky. This was not the first time the two men had seen strange lights in the sky in that area. They saw a similar light about 6 weeks previous and another light near Green Hill at the last full moon on May 10th. Now, Green Hill is where the Aboriginal gentleman was dragged out the window or extracted through the window. So, very, very common type of a sighting. Now, here we've got the location. So, this is the Karai Plateau area, and you can see it's just off to the northwest of Willy Willy. Willy Willy's on the right-hand side of the picture there. But it's all very remote area. I've not been up there, and one day I'd like to go up to Kempsey and check it out as a location, especially seeing it now has such a strong UFO history in that region. So they were up in that area around the tableland up there as contractors. So all these little reports are just gold. They really are. The next one. So the volume of this is just incredible. On Saturday, June 26th, 1971, the Argus had another article, and it was called "Strange Object Sighted in the Willawarrin Area." Now, I did mention Willawarrin earlier, so we did see that, and I'll just bring that back up again, just so we can know exactly where we're talking about on this one. No, sorry, that one. It's hard to tell. These are only very small maps that I'm looking at. So Willawarrin. So you see Willy Willy's over in the red area, and if you go directly across in a horizontal line, you'll see Willawarrin, and then just to the north again is Taruka. So these three little areas, they pop up quite consistently in these stories. So strange objects sighted in the Willawarrin area. 5 people had a UFO in view near Willawarrin for nearly 30 minutes on Thursday night. The sightings were made by a 4th form schoolboy, and his name was Graham Farrell, 16, of Taruka. He called his mother, who was the postmistress, Mrs. Dorothy Farrell, and his sister Julie, and then telephoned some friends, Mr. and Mrs. Michael Nugget, at Hickey's Creek. He said that he had first sighted the object at about 9:10 p.m. when he saw what he believed to be the light of a vehicle on top of the hill near the Taruka turnoff, just north of its intersection with the Kempsey Armadale Road. And he said the light suddenly appeared in the sky and 30 minutes later, just as suddenly disappeared. And he used binoculars to determine the shape, which he described as being like a helmet. He said the object was surrounded by a pulsating red glow, but the top gave off a steady orange light. There also appeared to be a horizontal light which produced a spectrum effect as if the object was rotating at high speed. So isn't that interesting? Graham said that for the half-hour period the object was in view, the family's radio was subject to severe interference. Now, I'm sure back in 1971, when the TVs in Australia were predominantly black and white, not every family would have had TVs, so they still probably did have a radio that they all sat around and listened to. And so on this particular occasion, the family's radio was subject to severe interference while the object was in the area, very common around the world. The UFO was about half a mile high in the sky and about a quarter of a mile from his home. So just think about that for a minute. Half a mile in the sky and a quarter of a mile from his home, and it's emitting something that's interfering with the radio. And in size, he described it as being about half the length of a small aircraft. So it's probably bigger than that, but that's his perceptive description of it. And his mother said yesterday that on Tuesday and Wednesday nights at the same time that she had seen a stationary red light over the same mountain, but a lot higher. And on both occasions, she had watched the object for about 10 minutes. And she had noticed it because it had been red in colour, slightly bigger than a star, and the light had been constant. Mrs. Nugget said she saw a light on Thursday low on the horizon in the direction of Willawarren, and it had been very bright and changed colours constantly, too bright to be a star. Now, a lot of people know that when a star is low on the horizon, it does get interference from the Earth's atmosphere, and it will actually show those red, green, and blue colours. But these people are country people. They live out and see the night sky all the time. And a lot of them have said that this has been too bright to be a star. That comes up quite a lot through these stories from that area. So I always like cases that have got radio interference, that where trucks and cars have been stopped. That's all really good things that are showing environmental effect on an object at that time. And it just keeps going. This is there's such a volume of reports that the Argus came out with at that time. So on Thursday, September 30th, 1971, this article is slightly interesting from the point of view that it's a local reaction to the UFOs and someone attempting to do something about it. So this is people taking positive action. And this is in the Macleay Argus. And it says that a UFO centre is planned. Students from Kempsey High School are setting up a UFO detection centre near Taruka. The spate of sightings in the area earlier this year has prompted the students to set up the base. The 10 students have formed a branch of the Sydney UFO Investigation Centre, and they hope to have their new headquarters operational by the end of the year. And the base will include a magnetic UFO detector. Working off a high aerial, the detector sounds an alarm when placed in a magnetic field, and that is a characteristic of UFOs. And a spokesman for the students said they hoped that interested residents throughout the area would act as spotters for them, advising them of sightings. And the students have already had several all-night vigils in the area and have sighted UFOs on many occasions. So the high school students of Kempsey were actually taking positive steps towards trying to find an explanation as to what was going on. They were all fascinated by it, and it sort of became a school project, which made it into the local paper. So that's very, very, very interesting and good to see that just how seriously this was being taken in the district. So not only have you got the newspaper reporting all of these encounters in a very sober way, as you can see, like, all these reports. There's no green smoke and woo woo stuff in any of these reports. It is matter of fact reporting of the events without any judgment whatsoever, which I really, really like about this Kempsey flap, is how well the local paper treated it and treated the witnesses, because there's been plenty of other instances in Australia where UFO witnesses have not been afforded the same courtesy. So, and the high school students are trying to find an answer as well. But we finally get a photograph of one of the objects. And that is big news at the time. And it's big news for us in this episode as well, because I'm going to show you that photo. So what happened? On Tuesday, November the 2nd, so we're into November now, 1971, the Argus reported that a boy's photograph of an unknown object was the headline in the paper. And a schoolboy who took an off-the-hip photo, so he just sort of went click like that, of an object he saw in the sky near Taruka, still has no clue as to its identity. So Leslie Farrell, 17 of Taruka, had been told by the Director of Research of the Unidentified Flying Object Investigation Committee of Australia, Mr. Frank Wilkies, that the object cannot be identified. So Les took the photo at about 7:30 p.m. on July 2nd from the yard of his mother's home. He used a colour film in his Kodak Instamatic camera. Now, a lot of people have had a Kodak Instamatic camera. And he made his shot off the hip as the object began moving through the sky. He said his attention had been drawn to it by a neighbour, a Mr. Ian Meehan, who had telephoned to say that he had seen something unusual. Now, Les says he picked up his camera, went outside, and saw a bright object in the northeast sky, about halfway between his home, the Taruka Post Office, and the Armadale Road. He used a spectrograph across the lens, hoping the spectrum of the light from the UFO would appear on the film. However, the distance was too great for this device to be effective. What he did capture was a helmet-shaped object. Now that pops up time and time again in the Kempsey reports. And it appeared to be ringed in orange-red, also what is described consistently throughout the Kempsey encounters. The colours varied from yellow to a creamy white in the centre. A mauve band, purplish band, or lavender colour, was visible through the neck at the top, where the whitish light merged into the orange object, the orange-red part. Now, Leslie did not remove the film from his camera, but he took it to Sydney, where a member of UFOIC supervised the development and the printing by an officer of the CSIRO, Mr. Wilkies. And Mr. Wilkies said the object did not have any detail, but it was not a star. If it had been a star, there would have been light glowing in all directions. The light is only glowing from the top in the photograph. The object appears to be a helmet-shaped UFO, a very common shape. And Mr. Wilkies also confirmed that a rock that had been found by Leslie was also being subjected to scientific examination at the University of Sydney. And he said that Les picked up a piece of slag near Willy Willy about 12 months ago. It was in open country and it was hot when he found it. Other rocks within a foot of it were also hot, even though it was on a winter's morning. So this is not midsummer. He's found a hot rock on the ground on a winter's morning. And out there in that area in winter, believe you me, it would be cold. The slag could not have fallen from a truck, and no flying apparatus uses this type of material. So there's no good explanation for this slag being in that location. Chemists in the lab suggested that there are types of material that did heat up when wet, but this experiment was tried without success, and they can only presume that the rock was hot when it landed. It was a very heterogeneous type of rock, tan-coloured, with horizontal black streaks of porous material, and light in weight, much too light and too porous to be a meteorite. Because that's the next thing you're going to say, is that, or maybe it fell out of the sky. But the scientists concluded that it was much too light and too porous to be a meteorite and to have survived a entry through the Earth's atmosphere. Now, Mr. Wilkie said the rock had been cut in the chemistry department of the University of Sydney, and a deeper analysis of its composition was now in progress. He said the slag type of material had been associated with UFO sightings since 1949, and that Kenneth Arnold had made a lot of it in his book, Coming of the Flying Saucers. And he mentioned slag being washed up in huge amounts for no apparent reason. No ships carry this type of material, but it's been seen being dropped by UFOs, and there have been numerous sightings of UFOs in the Willy Willy area since April of this year. So that's all very interesting. So let's have a look at a couple of pictures. So this is Leslie Farrell. So that was the young man who took the off-the-hip photo with his Instamatic camera in 1971. He was 17. And this is the area where he took the photo. So so you can see that there's the house in the distance, in the middle distance of that photo, trees in the background, and there's a little X just at the top there. And that was where the object actually was. And you can see that there's mountains in the distance there. So it's there certainly is a mountainous area. So that's that there. And so it's very interesting, the fact that he's actually got a photograph, and he found a hot rock as well. So that's really interesting. And on Tuesday, January the 18th, 1972, a UFO was sighted near a barn on a Kolombati farm. So that's really, really interesting as well. A really interesting encounter. A New Guinea visitor, so New Guinea is just north of Australia, was a visitor to a farm at Kolombati, was terrified on Saturday morning by a UFO which moved towards her as she walked out of the house. Mrs. Shirley Yarnold, now the Yarnolds had come up in part one, and this is on the same farm, and this is a separate report. Mrs. Shirley Yarnold of Port Moresby with her husband Lyle and family are visiting Mr. and Mrs. Peter Yarnold. It is this property that has been the scene of many sightings of UFOs. Since April 10th, positive sightings have been recorded. And her daughter Debbie said that her mother had left the house at about 3 a.m. and had seen near the barn, 40 feet away, a brilliant white light about 18 inches in diameter. The light was triangular in shape, except where the sides curved around the base. It was no more than 4 feet from the ground and appeared to move towards her as she fled inside in fear. Her husband, who was also following her out of the house, was in time to see a bright glow behind the barn, but did not investigate it. Mr. and Mrs. Peter Yarnold woke shortly afterwards, and when they got outside, it was to see a pulsating light disappearing in a westerly direction. Now, Sue and Debbie Yarnold, who had been sleeping in the barn for the past fortnight, added further mystery to this story. The girls said they had been awakened on several occasions between 1 a.m. and 4 p.m. by a feeling that the barn was shaking violently. Now, they initially thought that cattle may have been rubbing against the walls, but at no time had they heard movement or sound outside. On Saturday night at the time, Mrs. Shirley Yarnold was sighting her UFO the girls had again been awakened by the rocking or the shaking sensation of the barn. And as on previous occasions, this is interesting, ducks and geese had been disturbed and had shown signs of agitation. So we've got animals being affected by something in the area, and the barn has been shaking and rocking in a violent way. And on the Sunday night, the family kept vigil, but sighted absolutely nothing. And Sue said that the whole family had seen a light about 6 inches in diameter at about 7:30 p.m. on January 2nd. It had been pulsating all the colours of the spectrum before disappearing, all the colours of the spectrum, before it disappeared between two ranges in the Bellbrook region. The light had descended slowly at first and had then accelerated, leaving behind an orange glow above the trees. So that is a great sighting as well, where you've got physical interaction with the animals, a shaking barn, an object sighted. Really good case, high quality encounters that on their own would be interesting just on their own. But when you put it in the context of the whole Kempsey flap, it does make a really big difference. Now, on Thursday, April 25th, 1972, the Argus had an article again, and this one was another UFO sighted at Moonabah. Two families living on an adjoining property at Moonabah on Monday night sighted a UFO in about the same area and the same time as a sighting by a Mr. Fritz Friebel who lives nearby. Mr. and Mrs. Reg Purcell and Mr. and Mrs. Howard Lee watched the object for several minutes until it disappeared in a westerly direction towards Willy Willy. It's an area we're familiar with. And on Tuesday at Crescent Head, which is back on the coast to the east of Kempsey, at about 10:15, an Argus reporter walking in Hodgson Street sighted a brilliant object in the southwest sky that took 20 minutes to disappear in the direction of Kundabung. You've got to love these names. And the sightings have this in common. The light is brilliant and emits flashes of red, blue and green, purple and white at about half-second intervals. And the sighting comes exactly a year after a similar round of observations in similar locations last year. Mr. Purcell said on Tuesday night he had seen a light about 7:30 p.m. and had watched it with a telescope for about 5 minutes with the naked eye. And the light appeared to be a big, bright light. Under the telescope, he observed two lights, the larger appearing green and orange, the small a dull orange colour, and in a shape to be half a sphere. He thought the smaller light looked blurred. The light remained stationary in the Willy Willy Temagog area for some minutes before disappearing westwards towards Willy Willy at a fast speed. Mr. Purcell said the light at one stage disappeared completely, then reappeared with greater brilliance. And he believed the light was about 6 miles distant in the hilly country, and he thought it disappeared behind a hill in the Temagog area. And he said it was a few hundred feet up, say about 400 feet above the hill, which is about 100 feet above sea level. He said Mr. Friebel had spoken to him about his sighting on the Sunday night, and he had also mentioned that his cattle had been very resistive and difficult to handle on the Monday morning, to the extent that he had difficulty in yarding them for milking. So it happens quite often when cows have these experiences with UFOs that they become very agitated by it, and that can last for several days or even a week after these encounters. Mr. Lee said his dogs began barking and appeared to be very disturbed on Sunday night at about the time Mr. and Mrs. Friebel, who lived about half a mile away, made their sighting. And the dogs had also been barking a great deal on Monday night, just before Mr. Purcell had phoned him to tell him about the lights in the sky. Now, Mr. Lee, whose homestead is on the ridge, said the lights was about 15 degrees from the horizon and moved very slowly westward until just before it disappeared and then it vanished suddenly behind a hill. Better just grab a drink. The reporter said that the lights seen on Tuesday appeared flatter when seen through night glasses and was somewhat cylindrical in shape. When first sighted, it was dazzling in its brilliance. Within 20 minutes, it had moved very slowly southwesterly to disappear behind the top of a hill at the back of Mineral Deposits houses, which is obviously a company in that area. The reporters estimated that when first seen, the light was at an angle of about 40 degrees. When it vanished behind trees, it was at an angle of 10 degrees. The path it took can be gauged by the reporter eventually experienced in keeping it in view. After arriving home, the reporter had the light under observation from an elevated balcony that moved out of sight behind a neighbouring house and was then watched through a kitchen window. And eventually, to keep track of it, the Argus reporter went into the backyard and watched the light there. Now it was much dimmer and less spectacular until it was lost to view. So just another picture to have a look at is this one here. And this is Moonabar is down here in the bottom part of that, at the bottom right of this picture. And Willy Willy is all the way up there in the left part there. So we're still all within that major area. And this is Taruka down to Willawarren. And Willy Willy is across there. So just that little triangular area had seen all this great spectacular imagery and strange UFOs. Now, the other family who had that experience was, this article came out on Tuesday, April 25th, 1972, and it was called Family Sees UFO Land at Willy Willy. A family at Moonabar, Upper Macleay, on Sunday night saw a bright light, brighter than any star, come to Earth near Willy Willy, some miles to the west. Mr. and Mrs. France Freeble and their eldest children, Myra, 12, and Theo, 11, saw the light low in the northwesterly sky at about 7:30 p.m. And they had that light under observation for about 6 minutes. And Mr. Freeble said his wife sighted the object and it attracted his attention to it. My wife was looking at the sky and then she saw this low light on the horizon at an angle of about 20 degrees. It was not possible to judge the distance at night, so they didn't know how far away it was, but it was brighter than any star and had the power of a car headlight, and it seemed to be about 8 inches in diameter. And he knew of no light as bright or as clear that could match it except perhaps a spotlight. But it wasn't a spotlight, it was a clear glowing light that looked sometimes like a red car light, but it had gold and orange white light throughout it. So that's very common in all these reports, this orangey, red, white, yellow light, in addition to red, green, and blue and purple. When they saw it, it was stationary. And as they watched, it suddenly began moving horizontally to the south. Then it dropped at an angle of about 70 degrees and came down behind trees at a speed so fast it could not have been anything man-made. So it just dropped to the ground incredibly quickly. And Mr. Freeble said the light from the object was visible behind trees for a few seconds, and then it went out. He said the light was whitish in colour, and they could see it very clearly through the branches. The country around Moonabar is hilly, as we've seen in other photos, but I would say the object was about 600 feet above the trees before it dived instantly down to the ground. He said, we watched it for some time, but we saw nothing again. Now, Mr. Freeble said that there had been some clouds about at the time of the sighting and the conditions were hazy. The moon was in the first quarter, was fairly bright, but the haze made other stars appear as pinpoints of light. And he said this object was brighter than anything I've ever seen. And he described it as, it was horrifying. I've never believed stories about UFOs, and I thought it was all nonsense. But this is nothing to joke about. So there's a farmer who was very disturbed by what he had seen, something outside of his belief systems, no doubt, and he took it very, very seriously. Then, in June 15th, 1972, someone wrote a letter into the Argus newspaper, and it was titled "Strange Lights Sighted Close to the Power Station." And it said, "Sir, I'm writing to you to tell you about lights I saw on the riverbank on Saturday night, June 10, and to ask if any other readers saw them too. It was about 11:15 p.m. and I sighted two disc-shaped objects just above or adjacent to the electricity depot in South Kempsey. The lights were about as big as a full moon, dull orange in colour. They looked like outsized headlights, but were closer together than the shape. The shape was well defined, and the light they emitted was steady and constant. When I first sighted them, they just came on as if they turned on, and they went off the same way 30 minutes later. So there was nothing, and then these lights turned on, and then the lights turned off." And he kept on, the witness kept watching from a vantage point in Lord Street, and about 20 minutes later, say a little after midnight, I saw two lights appear in the northern sky between the PMG radio tower, which is the telephone tower, and West Kempsey Aerodrome, about over the aerodrome. And there seemed to be the same lights I had seen earlier, except they were further away and higher in the sky. They were in tandem and slightly smaller and dimmer. And he had them in view for 15 minutes, and then one light snapped out. 5 minutes later, the other light went out. And at no stage during the two sightings did the lights fade in any other way. They simply came on and they went off. And on other occasions, I've seen over Kempsey lights that have not been explained. But Saturday night was the first time I felt apprehension. The lights were so close, it was frightening. And I would prefer you not to publish my name or address for family reasons. Yours, the Watcher. So, very interesting report. Now, this next one is going to pretty much conclude the 1971-1972 parts of the Kempsey flap. So on Saturday, June 17th, 1972, the Argus reported they saw a light land near a hill. That was the headline. And 7 people saw a UFO land near Dalcongi Mountain on Tuesday. They had a strange light in view for about 15 minutes as it flew north to south above the mountain ridge. As it passed the mountain, it flashed on and off and then travelled in an arc towards the ground before disappearing. Now, Tom Fitzgerald, 13, of Washington Street, was walking his dog near his home when he saw the light. He said it was moving south just above the mountain ridge. It was red-orange with no definite shape and moving very slowly. Too slowly to be an aircraft, and it was not making any noise. He ran home and brought out his mother, brother, and neighbours to see the light, which was then approaching the highest peak in the ridge. Tom said that as the light passed the ridge, it flashed off and on twice, dipping towards the ground. It disappeared as if it had gone down behind the mountain. Tom's brother Gary, 12, and a friend, Colin Brenton, who was 11, said that the light changed colour as it passed over the mountain. Tom said it was his first sighting of a UFO, although he had scanned the skies every time he was outside at night, hoping to see one. So that pretty much concludes the 1971 and 1972 encounters and flap that had occurred around Kempsey. And as you can see, I've talked about this for 2 hours across 2 episodes, and I still haven't finished. So there's just so much more information. And I also realised that I didn't upload the photo of the UFO that the schoolboy had taken. As I'm looking through my photos, I realised that I didn't put it in there. So next week, stay tuned, because I shall have the photograph of the UFO that he took, and I'll make sure I upload it. And we will then talk about the information that Bill has given me, Bill Chalker, which takes the Kempsey flap into the latter parts of the 70s, or through the middle part of the 70s into 74, 75, 76, 1977. So we'll go through that part of it next week. And so that will then conclude the Kempsey analysis that we've looked at. And as you can see, the newspaper reports have been incredibly good. So thank you so much for joining me again as we explored Kempsey and all the strange mysteries that have occurred here. And I really look forward to picking it up again, just to conclude it with some more photos, including the one that he took of the helmeted object. And I will see you again next week. Have a great evening, and thanks for joining me.